Hello, welcome to Gimme Empathy. This is a podcast about people's lives and talking about their thoughts and values and what goes on between the grey matter. I'm your host, Scott Mercer, and this week is a very interesting episode of Gimme Empathy. If you read the title, you may notice that there are two guests on this episode, which is unusual. This episode requires a bit of explanation, and I need to tell you the story of a little cassette. So I've had this cassette sitting on my study table for many years, even through several moves of house. And it was there because I always meant to get around to digitizing it. I've always had the gear to do it. I've still got a tape player with an output that can go to a recording device. I just never quite got around to it. Now, on this tape was a recording that I'd made a long time ago. I'd actually forgotten exactly how long ago it is. But when I was, as far as I can gather, around 16 years old, I took the train out to Bingham to my grandmother's nursing home. At the time, she would have been 92 or 93 years old. And I took a tape recorder and I just talked to her about her life. And I recorded our conversation. And the funny thing is, I don't remember why I did it. At the time, I certainly had no ambitions of making a podcast. Podcasts, I'm pretty sure, did not exist when this recording was made. And yet, looking back, the funny thing is, structurally, the questions I ask, it's not so different to a normal Gimme Empathy episode. My grandma died in 2008. At the age of 96, and I always meant to digitize this cassette and send a copy to my mum just so she'd have something, just so she could have it and keep it. And I never got around to it. It was just one of those things that was always on my list of house things to get around to, and I never did. Until these last summer holidays, when I finally did. I just did. And so I went through and I was cleaning up the audio a bit and applying, noise removal filters because it was recorded on a tape recorder with one microphone between the two of us, my grandma and I, and there were always these budgies out at the nursing home, and they chirp basically throughout the entire talk. And you can hear people in the hall outside. At one point, a nurse comes in with Grandma's Christmas cards. An old guy just starts singing out in the hall somewhere. But it occurred to me that it might be interesting to put this up as an episode. So what I did was I cleaned it up, edited it, and I took it to my mum to get her approval before I put it out. And we listened to it together. And as we were listening, like unprompted, she started making notes about some of the details that my grandma had forgotten or misremembered. And ultimately I got the okay from Mum to put this episode out. But I also asked if I could talk to her as well to fill in a few of the gaps. So what we've got in the first half is the original conversation I had with my grandma, Mabel Bingham, back when I was about 16 or so. And in the second half, we have a new interview I recorded with my mum just last week, in which we kind of go over the Mabel's life story and fill in some of those blanks and get a bit of a different perspective on it. So there's a few details you need to know going in. Some of the people mentioned. My grandfather's name was Owen. You'll hear him start to get mentioned early-ish in the story. My mother is Ruth, and my aunt is Helen. Helen is also, by the way, the mother of Jeff and Jono from two previous episodes of Gimme Empathy. You might remember them. As might be expected, I wasn't a great interviewer at 16, and Grandma's train of thought can sometimes be a little bit hard to follow. Later in her life, she had a fair bit of confusion and memory loss, and what was probably dementia. You can see the strain on her memory, and this, I did have to edit it a fair bit because some of her pauses were very, very long at times. The interview also ends fairly abruptly because eventually Grandma just became pretty exhausted. I guess it just became too mentally taxing for her to go on. So with all that in mind, I hope you find this interesting. I'm pretty sure this episode will take and forever hold the record for the episode with the oldest guest. So enjoy my conversation now with my grandmother, Mabel Bingham. So, what can you remember about your childhood?
It was very different from today's childhood. We mostly went to school and played at home and that. Most people lived in weatherboard houses, and the roads weren't well-made roads, and it was a long walk to the railway station, and we had no electricity or power. At night, the lamplighter used to come round the street putting his stick up to light the lamps. It didn't get very bright light.
So where did you live when you were young?
Hurstville Grove.
And so is that in Queensland or New South Wales?
That's a good question. In New South Wales.
New South Wales?
Yes.
Okay. How many brothers and sisters did you have?
I had one brother, he was the youngest, and two sisters, and I was the eldest girl, so that was four of us.
Mm-hmm.
And must have been a pretty awful child. My father favoured my sister younger than I. There were only 13 months difference to her, and she was younger. And on Sundays we used to have a roast dinner, potatoes and all that. And Heather, her name was favoured always. She was the only one who could pick out the potatoes she would like. And she was always favoured over me to do anything special. But took a lot of going out of it, that's all right.
What did your father do for a living?
He worked at the government printing office in Sydney, and that meant he had a long walk to the station and would catch a train and then walk and come home the same way. So travelling took a long time, and sometimes he would take us into his work on Saturday morning, and which made a bit of a fuss of it.
And so there were no cars around, were there?
No cars, no cars, very few buses. Yeah, and there wasn't much contact with the railway station. I can't imagine distances, but I do remember one time at Christmas time we were going out on a holiday with people that lived about 3 stations nearer to the city, but we had to meet at Hurstville because that's where they changed trains, and the people were watching for us to come way up here, way down a long distance. They'll never make it. And we girls were sent on ahead, and then my brother was in a carrying basket, and there was the food. So off we went, and as we got nearer to the station, some of the people come down and met us and took our hands to hurry us up. They still said, they'll never make it. Well, eventually they came and met us, and some of there were about 3 or 4 families going, and we were going for several days to stay in a house. And they came and got us children and hurried us along, and somebody else went and bought our tickets. So that's the inconvenience of that day. Not good roads, long distance, no real connections like with buses and that.
Did you go on holidays?
Yes.
So where did you go for your holidays?
Well, down the south coast. Now I can't be sure whether it was maybe Hurstville.
And so is that on the beach?
Yeah.
What was your mother like?
What do you mean, to look at or? My mother was a very ladylike person, well-built, and a lovely mother.
And your father?
Well, he was a contrast. He was easy got cranky, and if we needed, we got the razor strap.
The what, sorry?
A razor strap. It was a razor strap was a leather strip that the men sharpened their razors on.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It was like a thick belt, to be about that long, about that thick, and about that wide. You wrap it around the legs and that. I got the most. Actually got used to it by the time. But yes, I don't remember being kept inside for anything. We had a lovely big camper laurel tree in our front yard. The one thing about the houses, you had a big yard to play in, and your friends could come in and play. And this camper laurel tree was in the front of the house.
Was the house very big? Was the house very big?
Well, we were three girls. That's a good idea. We three girls slept in a bedroom that was across the back of the house, like across the width. And we had three beds in there. And we used to have our bath in there, a big round tub. And down one end, my mother would put the hot water in and we'd have our bath in there. We didn't have a bathroom. And it was quite general not to have a bathroom.
So what did you play?
What did we play? Ball games and chasing games and running about.
And so did you have a lot of friends around the neighbourhood?
No. The girl that was her fence back into ours. And our school had a class that had moved away from the school quite near to where we lived. And she was having a party. And she didn't ask me.
Oh.
But some of my friends got an invitation for me. And my mother, I'll never forget this, she stood quite high and pleasant and said, "No daughter of mine will ever go on a piper's invitation."
A piper's invitation?
Yeah, I'd never heard this expression before.
What does it mean?
Well,
what does a piper's invitation mean?
Well, it was a late invitation and it had been got for me rather than in the first.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, even though I got the invitation, I didn't go.
Oh. So, what was school like?
I think we sat in rows on forms and desks.
So,
and a big blackboard out the front.
Yes, and I guess you learned the same things young children learn now, reading and writing and arithmetic,
Yeah.
3 R's.
Yeah.
Did you learn anything else?
History and geography.
So what did you learn in history?
I think mostly Australian history.
So you didn't learn a lot about overseas history and geography?
Not in the early classes, no.
No. So did you learn different subjects as you got older? Like did you learn science?
I don't think so. We didn't learn as science. We might have learned it amongst our lessons.
So did you go to high school?
Yes.
Yes. Did you learn languages there?
No.
No.
You could go on. I didn't go. I'm not quite sure whether I went to about grade 7 or 8.
Was the school one of the schools run by the church?
No.
No.
No, public school.
Public school. When you were young, what did you want to be when you were older?
I'm not quite sure. The first thing I did was do sewing, and I learnt to make my own clothes. And I remember we had a Sunday school picnic coming up, and I made a navy linen frock for my mother, who was a good-sized woman. I remember calling her, you know. I guess I did sewing pretty early.
How long did you live in the town that you were born in?
I can't quite remember. We moved from there to Cobra, which was where these families that we went on the holiday with lived. And they got us a cottage down there, and they were closer together than, you know, there were streets of houses.
What can you remember about church?
The church wasn't very far away. It was like 2 streets over. We walked to church and Sunday school. And there was another group, I'm not quite sure what group that was called now, that we used to go for games and things like that. And they were just like 1 street over from where we lived. And our Sunday school picnics and a lot of other picnics were held on a big paddock. It was called McRae's Paddock. Now I can't imagine mileage, it was huge. And we used to have picnics there and races.
What did you eat back then? What sort of foods?
My father grew our vegetables. A lovely vegetable garden. We always had something to eat, but I can't remember actually. And we'd have like a dinner of meal. We'd have all cold meals. And we cooked on a fuel stove, or my mother did. There was always boiling water on the stove. And she baked in the oven, and we learnt to do that as we grew older, to cook in fuel stoves, ovens. Anyway, came to make scones in the hot oven, and if we knew they were coming, we had small cakes and bigger cakes kept in a big tin.
Was there a shop near where you lived? A shop?
Shop. There was a shop eventually that we could walk to, but it was only a very small shop, you know, with food lines.
So you went to high school?
I don't know whether it was called high school or another name. I think I went to grade 9, but I'm not grade 8 or 9.
Okay, so what did you do after that?
I went to work in Sydney at Snow's, which was a great big store in the city, and they had a millinery section, and I worked in the laundry workroom.
Okay. About how old would you have been when you got your job there?
A bit hard to tell, probably 16.
Alright, so about my age.
Yes.
Yes.
And you'd buy a weekly ticket on the train. We moved to Cobra by then, and it was easy walking distance to train. And the trains were frequent during business hours. And I didn't have far. I went to Museum Station and just not far to walk to Snow's.
What were your siblings doing at this time?
Well, it would only be Heather that was working. I'm not sure where she worked. She went to a similar place, I think, to work in like a dressmaking or millinery workroom.
And the others were still at school?
Yes.
Yes. Do you know what your brother wanted to do when he was older?
No, I don't think I did. He was the youngest, and he won a baby competition.
A baby competition?
Yes.
Oh.
They had a baby show, you know.
Oh, yeah.
Can't even remember. I think that's right. I think he was a tool maker.
Okay. Right, so...
I want to cover a lot of people's lives in a short time.
Well, we can...
No, that's all right.
We can dwell on anything you want. We can go in more detail.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if anything, if you think of anything that might be interesting, feel free to butt in at any time.
Thank you.
So is there anything else about your childhood that you particularly remember?
I didn't marry young. And I've mentioned Cobra and Hurstville, I think, and in the church, there were 2 churches there. There were 2 youth groups, but Hurstville was bigger and better. You know, they had more accomplished people. And we used to go picnicking or to the theatre one night, meet in town after work, have tea and go to the theatre. We didn't do a lot of exciting things, you know, there wasn't a lot to do. And we carried cases, like, and had bags, you know, all kind of travel bags and that. We always carried a case. And the Hurstville boys would carry our cases mostly, or anything, you know. And there was one boy in Hurstville, and we used to have entertainment at our house, you know, games night and things like that. And Owen used to come quite often to our place. And the girls would say to the mother, "Owen's your favourite." "No, he's not, but he's a very nice boy."
This was while you were working in Sydney?
Yeah.
That's nice. Okay. How old would Owen have been at this time?
A bit younger than I was.
Mum said, I think he was about 10 years younger than you.
9 years.
9 years.
Oh, she did. Well, that photo, that big photo, was taken, must have been somewhere near the beginning of the war, because it was one Christmas and we both had a photo done, and he wrote on it, on his, to me, "If I go to war, will you please pray for me?" And his family were naval people from Tasmania, not going back. So we'd have a few trips to Tasmania. And he came home on leave and said he wanted to marry me, and I said, "Don't be silly." He was 9 years younger than me, but we were good friends and that, you know. And I knew, because of the way he went out of the way to take me home or carry my case and that, but I didn't take any notice of it because he was so much younger. And of course there were some of the older boys from Hurstville didn't return from the war. Anyway, he came home on leave and he brought me a green case Friday at lunchtime. I worked at lunchtime, and he said to me, "And I want to buy you something else." I didn't know what that could be. But that night he went to his parents and my parents and my doctor. Have you heard this story? And said that he wanted to become engaged and marry me. Well, I think both the parents agreed, but the doctor was doubtful.
Why would the doctor have a say in your marriage?
Well, I suppose he wanted to, Aaron wanted to know how we'd relate, and I guess if I was healthy or something, I don't know. Because during the war he met up with a lot of doctors, or met several doctors during the Navy, and we talked with them. And because I guess of the age difference, he wondered if, you know, I was too old or wasn't compatible or something.
So this was during the war, so you'd been working in Sydney for quite a while by then, hadn't you?
Yeah.
Yes. So how old would you have been? when Owen first asked to marry you?
He might have been 21 and I would have been 32, is that right? I'd have been 22 and I was 31.
So you'd spent a long time working in Sydney?
Yes.
Yes.
And because of the church groups, we'd meet at different times, and I knew his sister, played tennis with his sister, and he also joined the club. And then I had friends in the Hurstville club.
So Hurstville was the first place you lived in before you lived to...
Yes, but we lived in Hurstville Grove, which was a long way down the hill, and the Hurstville station was a shopping centre and up on the railway line. You know, things had progressed over that time.
Do you remember when you first heard that that Australia was going to war?
No, but I remember it, and I remember going into Sydney, the city, for March of the group that went away. This family was friends with my mother's, and they'd all been friends. I don't know the McMasters, but they've been friends for a long, long time. And some of their men were going to war, and we went in, lined the streets to watch the soldiers marching off to war.
So, were you ever worried that the war might come to Australia?
Oh, it was a possibility.
Like when the Japanese submarines shelled Sydney, you would have been working in Sydney then, weren't you?
Yeah.
Generally, were people very anxious about that?
Oh, I think so. But in the earlier part, you know, we younger people knew it was on and knew people going away and that, but like the first lot of people that I was speaking of, they were older than I was. You know, these friends of mothers. You get a bit difficult. Owen went at war was in Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Northern Australia, and in the Coral Sea battle. But because he'd worked in all those, they weren't considered overseas. He didn't get any payment when he left because they weren't considered then as overseas station, even when he was in the Coral Sea battle.
Oh.
And he was a signalman.
So were people who went technically overseas paid more?
And they got, when they retired, they got a payment.
Oh, I see, yes.
But if you hadn't worked overseas, you didn't.
So Owen came back on leave and he asked you to marry him and you said no the first time, is that right?
But he was very persistent, and we had 2 children, and in those days they had nurses, district nurses I think you called them, and when you were going to have a baby you didn't go to the hospital, the district nurse would come to you. And Helen was born and not successful, but Ruth was 3 months premature, which was very early in those days, and the nurse said it was 1 in 100 would pull through.
Wow.
And Ruth pulled through. They didn't have human cribs in the hospital, they just had hot water bottles and things like that. And in a country hospital was, you know, suburban really.
Just going back to when Owen was on leave, so you did get married while he was on leave?
Yeah, we most of it would be a long leave because we had planned a wedding to be catered for and going to have a dance hall and have dances, and we picked our dancers. Owen was a bit keen on dancing, and he'd be up on the floor first, and I didn't always want to be up on the floor first. And Well, that was all planned, and my father died. He was in hospital, but he wasn't expected to die. And Mother got word to come to the hospital, and my brother was, must have been married then, living away from home, and he said he got a landed motorbike and went straight to the hospital, and rang home and said, "Don't let Mother come, Dad's gone." But we didn't use taxis. We had a private driver, and what you call him, he used to do things, driving, but he wasn't actually a taxi. Wasn't ranked as a taxi. And because we had run him straight away to take Mother to the hospital, Mother stayed home and I had to go to the hospital there. And that was the first dead person I'd seen. And they hadn't even covered him, he was just propped up like that. He wasn't even covered up or anything.
What did he die from?
I'm not quite sure.
Because he can't have been that old at the time, could he?
Oh, well, I was growing up and was getting married, and Mother said, I can't think of anything. She wasn't going to go to the wedding. So we cancelled the reception at the hall and that, and Bingham's invited us to, we couldn't invite everybody, we invited some people to their home. And my brother led me into the church instead of my father. Next please.
So this was...
Coming up. Still.
There we go, Mabel. Hello, how are you?
Good, thanks.
That's good. There are a couple of, looks like, new Christmas cards for you, mate.
Oh yes, thank you very much.
You're right,
You
darling.
better hold on for it. Thanks very much.
You're right, love.
Do you want to have a break while you read your cards?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so when did you get married, Darwin?
I married, although all the arrangements were made, he died quite suddenly, and I don't know actually what. To check up with some of the family, and I can't be sure. I mean, he wasn't expected to die. I think he was expected to come home from hospital, and and of course, Mother was very upset about that. But all the invitations were out. It was in Hogwarts Church. It was quite a big church. So my brother gave me away, and he asked a lot closer people to come down to Bingham's, because all the food was ordered, and that's the caterers sitting that there.
And did you have a funeral for your father?
Yes, it's funny. It's not funny, but one of the girls mentioned it, the 13th of December he died.
That's my sister's birthday, isn't it?
I reckon.
That's my sister's birthday.
Oh, right, so it is. But yes, and he was expected to come home from hospital. Well, I'm not quite sure. I'm a bit mixed up now because we've just been talking about Owen's, and I'm now talking about my father. But he wasn't expected we expect him to come home because he was to give me away, and my brother Gordon gave me away. I guess Mother let as many people as she could know what had happened.
Alright, so after the wedding, did Owen go back to the war?
No, he was on leave, and we went into Sydney, stayed overnight at one of the big hotels, and we asked about breakfast, and the lady looked at us and said, "You mightn't want breakfast." And she said that you can have it in a room. We had a bedroom with a side room that you could have your food in, and it was a lovely place. And then the next morning we caught the train, I think, to National Park. You know the Sydney National Park? And we went there, and we had a very big room opening onto a balcony, and a bedroom and a sitting room. Yeah.
What happened when Owen's leave had run out?
He was probably in a close station, you know, when I was at close station like in Australia. Oh, a headache. Then it's hard to talk to anyone, I suppose. Isabel. I don't know.
Did you go to live with Owen? Did you go to live with Owen?
Yes.
Yeah. Once he left the Navy, did you go and live somewhere else?
Yes, I think I'm right. We moved to Coffs Harbour and Owen grew bananas.
All right.
And actually, that was part of the reason of his death, because he grew special bananas and used insecticides that caused cancer.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. He built the farm from scratch, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, so was that difficult?
It was hard work, but then, and we lived at first in a tent down by the creek, and he had built a kitchen, about 14-foot kitchen, I think, so that was on the bank, and we were across in a tent. We slept in a tent for a while, and he must have died in Coffs Harbour.
He must have died. He died in Brisbane, didn't he?
I reckon.
He died in Brisbane, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right, you never know. He died in Brisbane and the Coast Guard formed a guard upon him.
Yeah.
And it's only because we've talked about that recently that I could recall it. Yes.
So, back to the farm. How did Owen get the land that he used for the farm?
Bought it.
Okay. So did he have much money?
He had enough to buy the land, and also he built a sailing boat.
So did he build the boat the same time he was building the farm? Or was that later?
I think that was after we went into the church.
Okay.
Because under the manse at Mount Isa, I think it was, he was building this boat. And they wouldn't know why I was building a boat in Mount Isa, you know. But we got some of the timber down a long way to the place where it before, which I've forgotten. He bought the timber off land there, and then we sent that up on the train and lived to Mount Isa. And by now he's in the industry.
Did it take very long for him to get the farm up and running?
He used to work day and night. No, not actually night, but not set hours he'd work. And he did some crops. Remember, we had a lovely crop of tomatoes, and he was going in next day to order the cases for packing them in. We had a storm that wiped out the tomatoes.
You had Helen on the farm, didn't you? She was born in Coffs Harbour? Yeah. So what was it like having your first child?
Well, I think I said something earlier about living out of town, and I guess Ellen took me into the hospital.
So how long did you live on the farm in Coffs Harbour?
I can't quite remember. Because while we were at Coffs Harbour, he did some mission work on Ruth Island. And it was during that time that Helen and Ruth went to school in Sydney at an Anglican school. And I was very upset about this because Ruth was only 5 and the church decided if Helen was going, Ruth should go too. And now those 2 girls say to me, you sent us to a Church of England school, and they are Church of England.
So was there a uniting church you could send, a school that you could send?
No, an Anglican church, because we were just kind of missionaries up on Ruth Island, and the girls were up there. And then when they thought Helen should go to school, they said they both could go. And now they're halls it against them. Not really, you know.
So was it in Coffs Harbour that Owen first joined the ministry?
Not at first, we went out as missionaries to Ruth Island. Owen must have done some studies, but he then applied for candidate, I think, for ministry. Therefore, he took a longer time to do the course.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing happened when we left. Because he was late in joining, we didn't get any. We had to buy into the fund for retired ministers, and we didn't do it. Something like $700 and something dollars, but we didn't have money, and we decided that we wouldn't join.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore we don't receive money as retired people.
On Ruth Island, where did you live?
Oh, it was a settlement and there were cottages there.
Mm-hmm.
And there was schooling there and other family groups and hospital.
So if there was a school, couldn't Helen and Ruth have gone to that school?
No, it was Aboriginal school.
Oh, okay. And then white children weren't allowed to go to Aboriginal schools?
I'm not quite clear about this.
Were there many white people living there?
Well, very few families because there were school teachers and maintenance men, you know, and their families, and gardener, shopkeeper.
Did you do any missionary work, or were you at home with the kids?
We used to take RE in the schools, I think. I'm not quite sure, but there were always jobs that were kind of bonded, teaching the youngsters to sail and things like that. It wasn't like actually an employed job.
Yeah. Mum remembers that you had a cat there on Ruth Island, and it ran away one time, jumped off the back of a truck.
Yes,
And then it followed you and it found you again, is that right?
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, we were at Umbercumber then.
Unbelievable.
Hey, your mother's been talking.
It's
I don't mean,
Yeah.
you know, I'm just surprised that she has remembered these things.
Mm.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. And I don't know the distance between the two stations.
In your time on Ruth Island, you stayed in 2 different settlements?
Yeah.
Okay. The children went off to boarding school in Sydney.
I reckon.
The children went off to boarding school in Sydney.
Yeah.
And so, and you and Owen stayed on Ruth Island?
Yeah.
So how long did you stay on Ruth Island after that? Alright, so after that, did you go to live in Mount Isa? Alright.
the end of the session.
So that's the end of part 1 of this podcast. I never recorded any follow-up interviews with Grandma, and a few years later, in 2008, she died at the age of 96. The second half of this episode was recorded very recently, in February 2018. I sat down with my mum to talk about Mabel's life and fill in some of the gaps. So here's that conversation now. So I normally start by asking my guests how they know me. So I guess this must be the most redundant one ever. So Mum, how do you know me?
Scott is my son.
So you've known me from a very young age then?
The very youngest.
So I particularly want to have you on today because I played an interview I did with your mother, Mabel, that I recorded a long time ago. We listened to it together because I wanted your okay before I put it out there. And you made some notes, and because there were a few, it was cut a bit short because I think at the time of recording, Grandma was got a bit worn out by the whole process, and there are a few gaps and a few confusing bits in the story. So I just wanted to, and on your own, unprompted, you started taking notes while you were listening, and we paused and talked about some of the timeline and when exactly things happened, and you elaborate on a lot of things. I just thought that was really interesting, and it would be interesting for the audience to kind of hear.
It was clear that the chronology was not quite accurate. And at that time, Mum would have been 92, 93. So she was starting to have some of the forgetfulness of old age, some memory loss. She didn't actually have dementia, but she definitely had a memory loss that I think most people get once they hit 90.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you could tell when you're asking questions about specific things like how long or when was that, she got a bit stressed because she realised she didn't have the answer, and she was worried that she didn't have the right answer.
I noticed the first thing that struck you when you were listening was that you said that you didn't really recognise her voice.
Yes, to me, she just sounded like an old lady. And yet, if I remember her voice, I remember her as a lot more vibrant and a lot more young.
Because I guess I only ever knew her as an old lady, as a grandma, whereas for most of your life, she was a lot younger, and she was just in her mum years. Yeah.
And she actually had quite a young voice. If you heard her on the phone, you would never think she was as old as she was.
So let's talk about her marriage and like when exactly all that happened, because there was a bit of confusion around that. So Owen was out on the sea in World War II was it the HMAS Hobart?
That was one of the ships he was on, yes. He was also on the Vendetta.
And he was a signalman.
Yes.
What did a signalman do?
He was an enlisted man, so not an officer. And I'm not sure, I guess signalled from ship to ship, I don't know. Communications, I guess, whatever the communications were in those days.
And so he came home on leave and proposed?
Look, they married after the war.
Right.
I'm not sure when he proposed.
And we were looking through some photos the other day, and we found a wedding card was it from Heather?
One of Mum's sisters.
One of Mum's sisters, and it was dated March 1946. So that was when exactly?
After the war.
Right, yes.
So they definitely married after the war, but I think they had a little bit of a long-distance romance going during the war. They wrote to each other, and Dad used to tell the story about when he was stationed in Darwin that Mum sent him a case of Granny Smith apples. Clearly he was lacking some fruit, and I guess they would have had fairly restricted rations, and that's what he was yearning for, and she sent him a case of Granny Smith apples.
Wow. Did they keep their letters that they sent to each other? Did you ever find any of them?
Ah, no. In fact, Mum burned a lot of stuff. Dad had a few photos. You know, you weren't supposed to take photos when you're in a war zone or at war, but he did have a few photos. I remember as a child seeing photos of ships and like cannons, like smoke puffing up, and groups of men sitting around. just in the big baggy shorts and no shirts on the deck of a ship. But that's about it. And he never talked about the war, which is common for the men of that age. After World War II, they come home, they start their life again, and they don't talk about the war.
So when did Grandma's father die? Was that right before the wedding?
It was just before the wedding, so it must have been February in 1946.
And how did he die?
Interesting, an unnecessary death, because he would have only been in his 50s. He went into hospital to have a very simple operation, a hernia, but he developed an embolus, a clot. And, obviously it either travelled to the heart or the lung, and it died from it. And that would have been because in those days they kept you in bed. You weren't allowed to get up. You were in bed for days after having an operation. And it would have just been presumably the inactivity where his blood clotted.
Did Grandma ever talk much about her dad?
I got the impression that he was quite stern. She was very fond of her mother, and she was a lovely grandma to us. But she didn't speak all that lovingly of her father.
And one of the things Mabel didn't really talk about at all when I talked to her, and I guess I didn't ask about it, was that before she had you and Helen, she and Owen had 2 foster children.
That's right. It took a while for them to have children. 3 years, which isn't a long time, but because of her age, and she was 36 when she married, they were quite concerned that it was taking a long time to have children. So they had decided to foster someone, a ward of the state, and they had decided a boy would be useful because they had a farm, and it's always good to have a boy to help around the farm. So my dad got the train to Sydney. It was all arranged to pick up the boy he was going to bring home, and the Department of Children's Services, whatever it was, then said, "Oh yes, here's the boy we've organised for you, but he's got a younger sister. She's highly emotionally dependent on him. In fact, she doesn't speak, and they're very close, so we don't think it's a good idea to separate them. Would you like to take the girl as well?" So he came home on the train with a boy and a little girl. She was about 3. I think he might have been about 6. Surprise, surprise. 2 children instead of 1.
So you and Helen grew up with 2 siblings for most of the time?
For the first, in my life, it was only about for the first 4 or 5 years of my life. The boy went off to a school in Sydney. Obviously, they'd come from a very troubled background because he was becoming a little bit violent and difficult to manage. And by then, there were 3 girls with the oldest boy, and my parents were quite concerned about the influence he was having on us, and that he could be quite violent.
So that was Norman, and
Yes.
and the sister was Robin.
Yes.
Yeah. When I talked to Grandma, she mentioned that before Owen proposed to her, he went to his parents to ask if it was a good idea. He went to her parents to ask permission, and he also went to a doctor. It sounded like he went to Mabel's doctor to ask if that was a good idea. And,
Yeah, weird.
and that was weird. Yeah, it was a bit weird.
I'm wondering if that was because of her age. He wanted to ensure that it was safe to have children, to plan a family. I'm just thinking that was what it was.
And so, but it's kind of incredible that a young man could go to a woman's doctor and ask private information about, whether she was fit to bear children.
I know, and who knows, maybe they went together. I don't know. I mean, it does sound very intrusive.
Mm.
Yeah, maybe Mabel went with him, who knows. But yes, it sounds odd. But I was discussing this with my sister, and she said she knows that his parents, Owen's parents, were not in favour of the marriage because of the age gap.
Ah.
And I think they felt he could have done better, in inverted commas. So maybe there was a bit of pressure from his parents as well. Are you sure she's going to be able to have children and things like that?
So what was Mabel's relationship with Owen's parents, from what you remember?
Her relationship with her mother-in-law was always a little bit strained, I think.
But they eventually accepted her?
Oh, yes, they did, yes. And her father-in-law, I remember as a very lovely man too, very sweet, very pleasant. And, of course, they obviously adored their grandchildren, so that's how I remember them. But his mother was a bit perhaps waspish, a bit sharp.
So the family moved to Coffs Harbour. Was this after Helen was born?
No, Coffs Harbour was as soon as they got married.
Oh, right.
It was a farm. He took up a return serviceman's settlement grant and became a banana farmer. And he was a city boy, she was a city girl, and never done any farming before. But I think this was post-war. What do you do? He had no skills or training apart from being in the Navy, being a sailor. So there were obviously servicemen's grants going, and he took up a block of land and started from scratch with a banana plantation.
And you came along a few years into that?
Yes, of course, they fostered 2 children. Then my sister was born in 1949 and I was born 3 years later.
What do you remember about the banana farm?
I remember the smell of tomatoes. They grew tomatoes and beans as well. And I love the smell of tomato leaves. I remember going up to the packing shed where you packed the bananas in big deal boxes, and they go on the train to Sydney, and we would put the stencil on the end of the boxes. So the big stencil of the farm they came from, there was a big, like a tar brush and a tin stencil, and we were allowed to put the stencil on the end of the box.
And you were telling me yesterday that that was your cot when you were a baby as well, one of the banana boxes.
Yes, because I was a premature baby, 3 months premature, in fact, which was pretty unusual in 1952. And they took me home and they had to keep me warm. So they put cotton wool in the box and sat it in front of the fire.
How old were you when you left Coffs Harbour? She consults her notes.
Yeah, 1958 and 59, might have been the end of 57, so I would have been 5, turning 6. And we went to a tiny little place nestled in the border of New South Wales and Queensland, tucked away under Mount Lindesay, little town called Woodinbong.
And what do you remember about Woodinbong?
Well, it was only about 3 streets one way and 4 streets the other. But it was a neat little town in a dairying and timber district, so lots of farms. That was when I started school, so I did year 1 and year 2, and we'd walk down the hill to the school, but other kids in my class rode horses to school from their farms, and there was a paddock in the schoolyard where everyone just tied up their horses.
Wow. Did you ever get to ride any of the other kids' horses?
Oh, we'd go and visit some friends on a farm at weekends and we'd ride horses.
Why did the family move from Coffs to Woodinbong?
Okay. They'd been 12 years on the farm and they had made a profit, and my father felt that he was a bit of an adventurer. He felt it was time to move on and do something else. But also he was a man of faith, and he felt called to work in ministry, helping people in ministry in the church. So this was his first appointment as like a pastor. He was not an ordained minister, but he was a pastor.
So from Woodinbong, was Mount Isa the next place you lived?
No.
Oh, where were you next?
After Woodinbong, 1960, we went to Charlestown, a suburb of Newcastle.
Oh.
And Robin was still with us then, and she was 8 years older than me, so she was at high school. Helen and I were in primary school, and it was just for 1 year. We were in a big old manse. The manse was the house that the minister lived in next to the church. Lovely timber, tongue and groove old house with verandas, and I just remember the nice old houses.
So were these all just a series of appointments?
Yes.
Within the
Yes.
church, which is why you moved about?
Yeah.
How did Mabel feel about moving around a lot?
I think she was a very traditional wife, and she went with her husband no matter what. She didn't really consider it was her place to have an opinion.
Did she have any hobbies?
When you were the minister's wife in those days, it was like you were an unpaid worker. She would do things like running women's groups, Bible studies. She taught RE in schools. She would play the organ in church.
I didn't know she played the organ.
Yeah, yeah. Not consistently, but fill in. She was like a bit of an unpaid worker, whatever needed to be done for the church. She was there.
You were telling me yesterday that in those days the ministers weren't really paid very much, but they kind of had a lot of things provided for them.
Yes, you had your house, and traditionally it was right next door to the church, so people would knock on the door asking for help. And I also remember we would have swaggies, like homeless people wandering up and asking for a meal.
Oh, wow.
And often, Mum would be taking something out of the fridge or making cut sandwiches for them to take on their way. And, it was a little bit of a generalised social service, the church.
What do you remember about going to church when you were little?
When I was little, going to church? Well, I remember, I can remember at Woodinbong, we all sat down the front, the family, we'd dress up, and I've got pictures of us all wearing hats and gloves to church. Midway through the sermon, Mum would just pop out and check the roast that was in the oven. I don't know if she sometimes took a bit more than she needed to check the roast because she was getting a bit bored. But, and it was perfectly acceptable. Everyone knew she's just popping out to check the roast because we all have Sunday roast.
And in these little towns, did pretty much everyone in town go to church?
One of the churches, a lot did. It was often the centre of social activities too. Yeah, I think for many country women, the church provided socialising, friends.
So what came next?
Well, after Charlestown was Groote Island. Dad felt very much called to do some kind of service with Aboriginal people. So he offered himself to the Church Mission Society, which was the Anglican Missionary Society. And with his farming experience, they said, yeah, we need an agriculturalist. So he went to Groote Island, which is in the Gulf, and became an agriculturalist there to establish crops, to teach the Aboriginal people farming and animal husbandry. Yeah, they were there for about 4 years.
And how old were you? What's that time period in your life?
They went there from 1961, so I was 8. I remember getting off this little plane on an airstrip, little dirt airstrip on Groote Island, and I was suddenly surrounded by a sea of Aboriginal kids and women, all these people touching me, touching my hair, gabbling in a language I didn't understand, but obviously really, really intrigued because I was blonde. And turned out we were the first white children of our age they had seen. They had seen babies, white babies. They hadn't seen children our age, and we were very pale, and I was blonde, and everyone kept touching me. And I was sort of, that was my first experience of what it's like to be different from everyone else.
And as for you, had you encountered Indigenous children in school before that?
Yes, at Woodinbong we had the Aboriginal settlement just outside town, and there were rows of little cottages built. It was a settlement built on the edge of town, and my dad used to go and visit them, and we had some Aboriginal kids at school.
But so that sounds like it was kind of segregated in Woodinbong, that
yes.
they all lived in this part, we all lived in this part.
Yeah, it was the Aboriginal settlement on the outskirts of town. Yeah, absolutely.
What was the kind of the prevailing social attitude towards Indigenous and white relations in those days?
Look, hard to know as a child, but my sister remembers telling me that there was an Aboriginal kid at school called Mopsy, and Helen, my sister, said that she went out of her way to be her friend, and the kids would say, don't drink out of that tap, that's the blacks' tap, and she also made a point of drinking out of that tap. So interesting that even then she had a sense of fairness.
And this is even before the referendum to
Oh, yes.
give Indigenous people the vote.
Yeah, that was 67. I actually remember that. I actually remember we were on Groot Island and someone from the government or politicians or something were coming out and talking to all the Aboriginal people. I don't know if it was a consultation or if it was, vote for me, but I do remember when that happened.
What else, did you go to school there?
My sister and I did correspondence for 1 year, and then we were sent to boarding school in Sydney. But Groot Island was a very, very traditional Aboriginal community. There was very little influence apart from the mission at that time, and culture was very, very predominant. There were lots of ceremonies, women's ceremonies, men's ceremonies, music. I remember going to sleep each night with the sound of didgeridoo and clapping sticks and people singing from the village. Or we went to church and we sang songs in language.
What was the language up there?
Anindaliagwa. And we would hang out and play with the girls. Girls probably a bit older than us who had English enough to communicate well with us, and they taught us words. We knew quite a few words in Anindaliagwa, and not just words, but body language. And anyone who's had much to do with traditional Aboriginal peoples, that body language is really important because you communicate over distance, and it's the way you move your face, hand signs. Yeah.
So Owen was teaching agricultural studies.
Mm-hmm. He established the farm and grew veggies and fruit and stuff.
So there was a church-run program. So what compelled the local people to actually go there? Were they interested in becoming farmers?
Look, it was a very early settlement. It had been there a long time, and it was all one settlement. White people lived here, and the Aboriginal village was right next door, but it was almost like a coexistence, and there was an established workshop for mechanical things. There was a shop. There was a hospital. Aboriginal people were either employed at the mission or, like older people, they still hunted, they fished. Being an island, there was a lot of seafood. Yeah, it seemed to me from a child's perspective quite a happy, idyllic existence.
So the Anindaliagwa were still living a very traditional life, and had the very traditional relationship with the land. So why did the church want to make them farmers? You're shrugging. So was it also a religious kind of education, like trying to convert?
Well, there was a church. There was an established church, yes, and they encouraged people to get married in the church. Yeah, they were teaching them about God. Yes,
and kind of
the original
and European culture, I guess.
I got a sense that the traditional culture was really well respected. They didn't try and stop it. The white people didn't try and stop culture and ceremonies and the music. My dad would tape music and take pictures of people traditional, dressed, and the men were sometimes invited to ceremonies, and I can remember them taping music, but there are some ceremonies no white people were invited to, but it seemed to me to be a bit of sharing. There'd be having a sing-along in the village, and we'd go down with our mum and sit with the women and sing and listen to the music.
And did Mabel have much to do with the local women?
Yes, the aim of the mission wives was to teach the women skills, like housekeeping skills. So we had women who would come to our home most days and do things with my mum, like housework, washing, making bread, cooking, because it was fairly basic. We didn't have electricity. There was no electricity, no hot water. So just everyday housekeeping required a lot of work. And the point was that you were teaching the Aboriginal women skills. Did
they ever teach Mabel any of their skills?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, we learned to make great damper. We also went walkabout with the girls, the school girls. We went bush and camped on the beach and they went hunting. We were with the school teachers, were there, but our parents weren't there. My sister and I went out with the school girls, with the school teachers, and found little shells. They went fishing, dug for, I suppose it was yam, dug for things, looked for wild honey, sugar bag, we called it.
As you've got older, you're a fairly progressive person, and you've worked in community health and with marginalised groups and culturally diverse groups throughout most of your life. Has your view of the work that Owen was doing as a Christian missionary in an Indigenous settlement, has that kind of changed over time?
Look, I think my interest in diversity now was formed by that diversity I experienced as a young child. Certainly, I think my sense of social justice comes from my parents. And I only ever saw mission work as helping people into the 20th century. After the mission, the settlement is still there. I don't know if it's a mission now, but mining came to Groote Eylandt in the years after we were there, and with mining came a lot of money, also alcohol and drug problems, and they certainly were never there before that commercial, let's make money out of the place. The missionaries weren't there to make money out of the place. It was almost like we're there to one, teach people about God, and yet there was also a respect of traditional spiritualism, I sense. It was like it wasn't mutually exclusive, because so much of the traditional spiritualism was supported and encouraged. So I get a sense that the missionaries originally were there to teach people about God and to help people into the 20th century in a positive way.
So you went to Sydney to boarding school, and when Mabel talked about that, she remembers it as being a bit distressing for the family, because the church were taking Helen into boarding school and said, well, if we're taking one, we may as well take both of them.
Well, she was going to high school. It wasn't considered that you got a good education if you stayed home. It was considered established practice, that once you went to high school, you went to boarding school.
Do you remember that time when it was when you found out you were going to Sydney as well?
It was, I think I was probably a bit excited, wasn't sure. Our mother made us new dresses to wear.
She made you dresses?
Oh, yes, she did all the sewing.
How long were you at boarding school in Sydney?
I was there from 1962 to 1965, middle of 1965. So 2, 3, 4, 3.5 years, 4 years.
What was it like being separated from your parents for the first time?
Look, I think it was probably quite difficult for me, whereas my sister, being that bit older, enjoyed it. She relished it and got into the teenage years. I think I was probably a bit too young. I have been remembered as a very quiet, introverted child. I think I was probably pretty lonely. And it wasn't just missing my parents, it was a whole culture shock of being in a big city and a boarding school with girls who were not like us. Most of the girls who went to boarding school in those days were from country New South Wales. I guess you could call them landed gentry.
Oh, so rich country kids.
Yes, rich country kids.
Because this was still being paid for by the church.
Our education was paid for, yes, but the other
Right.
kids, that they were wealthy.
Yes.
Wealthy girls from often country New South Wales.
How long did Mabel and Owen stay on Groote Eylandt?
Okay, that was about 5 years altogether. 61 to 65, and I suspect Dad always said he got a bad back there. He was doing a lot of manual work and he was getting a lot of problems with his back, and I suspect too that they felt that their daughters were growing up away from them and away from their influence. After Groote Island, my dad offered himself back as a minister in the Presbyterian church, and he was sent to Gympie.
Yeah, there's a bit of a cloud between Groote Island and when I knew Mabel and Owen when they settled down in Manly.
Yes. Oh, yes, there's a few more places there to go yet.
So they kept shuffling around.
Kept moving. And talking to my sister today, she said it's quite sad, but by the time when my mum was in the residential care facility in her old age, that was the place she had lived longest in all of her adult life. I mean, they moved every 3 to 5 years, 2 to 3 to 5 years. And the church did that with people. But I suspect my dad was a bit of a gypsy anyway. He was quite happy to experience different places.
Did you get the feeling that Mabel was also into, like she didn't mind moving around so much?
No, I suspect she might have preferred to put down roots.
So you went back to live with them for the end of high school?
I went back to Gympie mid-1965, and I would have been in about, I went into year 8. My sister stayed to the end of the year in Sydney at school because it was year 10 for her, so it was quite an important year, and she stayed there for 6 months. And I felt a bit resentful that she got to stay till the end of the year and I had to go and start a new school.
And how did you find school in Gympie?
Well, after being in an all-girls school, a private school, I went to Gympie High School in 1965, and it was a bit of a shock again.
So this was a public school?
A public school, yeah. There were boys in my class, but they were all, to me, of course, very immature boys. I felt kids weren't well behaved. I felt there was no discipline. Yeah, I just felt I did feel it was a bit snobby. It was a lower standard of education than I was used to. I mean, I found everything very easy. Coming from New South Wales to Queensland too, I probably fell halfway through the year structure, so I kind of was quite a high achiever in my class, but I'd probably done a lot of the work before.
And how long did they stay in Gympie?
Till the end of 1966, so really only 1.5 years. And then my dad came to Brisbane finally to study at the theological college. He actually, all these years he was studying like for his high school leaving, because he left school at 14.
Oh.
So he'd never completed high school. So he was doing this sort of study towards ministry in order to go to uni and achieve his degree. So he got a church at Salisbury in Brisbane. We were there for 1 year, and then we moved to St Lucia, and he was going to the theological college at St Lucia.
Do they still have a theological college?
The churches have theological colleges in different places now.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was on campus at UQ then, and we lived just 2 streets away.
And when was their next move?
Then they went to Emerald. That was 1970 to 72, Emerald, and that was, I went nursing, so that was the last time I lived at home with them at St Lucia.
After that, in that time period, like what was your relationship with your parents once you moved out and you were a young adult?
I guess we were pretty independent once we left home. My sister had left home earlier. I know it was a good relationship with our parents. We loved them, but we probably didn't feel particularly close to them.
My early memories of Mabel and Owen were when they were living out at Manly. I don't have many early memories because Owen died when did Owen die? It was the early 90s. I was about 5 or 6,
You're
I think.
4.
4?
I think
okay.
you were 4.
I do remember him.
91.
I remember liking Granddad and going out on his boat, the Umbacumber. And I remember him being in hospital and I drew him a picture of a boat and took it to him. Grandma said at one point when they were at Coffs Harbour that there was some speculation that some insecticide they used may have contributed to his cancer. Was that ever proven or anything?
No.
Right.
No, he died from stomach cancer at a relatively young age. He died at 71, which these days is not that old. And it was stomach cancer, and stomach cancer is not the most common of cancers. And look, no idea how he got that, but he would have been exposed to insecticides as a farmer that nowadays, would not be used. That's all. It's just supposition.
How was Mabel when Owen died?
I think she was pretty devastated because being older than him, she always assumed she would be the one to die first. She had never planned to be the one left behind. And I think for many years she had quite a low-grade depression.
And how long did she keep the house?
When Dad was diagnosed with cancer and he knew that he didn't have a long time to live, he sold the house. He made the decision to move into like a residential care facility. It was called a hostel level of care, because he felt that Mum would not do well on her own. So they moved into a hostel, and then he died, I think probably only a year later. And then Mabel was left on her own in this hostel, which then became an aged care facility. And in a way, I think that was a bit premature of him to make that decision. I think she could have been independent for a lot longer if she'd been given the opportunity.
In the early years, how did she do in that facility?
Look, she was very active. She enjoyed all the usual church activities, including women's groups. She also went to art classes. She'd get on the train and come into the city and meet me. She'd socialise. She'd go out and about. I think she probably was quite social.
I guess the things I remember, are more towards the end. And she didn't seem very happy there.
No, I think in the end she was quite depressed. Do you remember her coming to visit us when you were little?
For Christmas and things, yes. And we saw yesterday there's some photos from when we lived at Highgate Hill of her on the back deck. And yeah, I remember her being around when I was little. And then more just going out to see her later on when it was more difficult for her to get about. And yeah, I remember as a teenager and in my early 20s going out to see her on my own sometimes. I think you really encouraged that. I sort of didn't know what to do or to say when I'd go out there. And she wasn't as, I could go and see my other grandma, Dad's mum, and you didn't need to say anything because she was such a chatty person.
She'd chatter on.
But Mabel was a little more reserved, I suppose.
Yes. And
eventually, I guess, and it was very, very difficult for everyone in the end because her memory loss got very bad.
Yes.
So did she actually have dementia of some sort?
Look, I think everyone has a little bit in their 90s. She certainly had some memory loss and confusion, which is a definition of dementia, really, memory loss plus confusion. But it wasn't Alzheimer's.
No, yeah.
Yeah, so she probably did have just some dementia by the time she was well in her 90s.
As someone, so you went on to be a nurse and then working in community health, so you would have encountered lots of people with the sort of symptoms she had by the end of her life. Was it still difficult for you to go and visit her as she deteriorated?
Yes, I mean, it's still sad even though you understand what's happening. It's still quite sad. I remember once, it was very poignant. I was explaining something to her about her life. We did memory books and we had pictures around and that, and I was explaining something to her about her life, and she said, even Owen doesn't come to see me anymore. And so I said, oh, Mum, he died quite a few years ago. And she said, why don't I know these things? Why don't I remember? So she was aware of her memory loss. And that's hard when you know that, you're losing your capacity.
And in the end, she didn't die of anything in particular, did she? Just old age? Just
old age, really. She had some chronic health problems, but it was probably congestive cardiac failure or something in the end, but no, just diseases of old age.
Have you ever specifically like thought about, how your parents lived their life and consciously tried to be like them, or specifically not do things the way they did in any way?
I'm grateful. I think my faith, my sense of social justice is learned from them. I guess I was a little bit, I was very conscious of the fact that I moved around a lot as a child, and that's probably not something I would do with my own children.
And we didn't. We
We stayed in Brisbane.
went to the same primary school and same high school all the way
Yes.
through. Well done.
I think my father had a very adventurous spirit and was willing to take on new challenges and go to new places, and I hope I've got a little bit of that too.
Whatever happened to the boat, the Umbacumber?
Well, for many years, in his retirement, he sailed in Moreton Bay. They did a few trips up to Bribie, not very long trips. They'd go out overnight. And then he sold it to someone to use for Sea Scouts, to teach a group of Sea Scouts to sail.
Yeah.
It was sold after my dad died.
Do you ever wish you'd kept it?
Oh, absolutely. But can you see you and Miranda sailing? Really?
No, I mean, I can just see it sitting in a garage for 20 years or something.
Yeah, I took you as little kids, but yeah, you actually need at least 2 people to sail it. Yeah, and boats are not cheap to keep moored.
Do you think Mabel had a happy life overall? Did she have any regrets?
Look, I suspect that she had a fairly Victorian childhood and background. When you think she was born in 1911 and not a lot of money, she lived through the Depression, 2 world wars. I think when she married Owen, her whole life opened up. She travelled. She would not normally have travelled so much. She met some very different people, lived in different places. I think maybe there was a little bit of tension between wishing she could just stay in a nice cosy cottage somewhere but also she responded to she followed him wherever he went, and I think she probably did enjoy adventures that she would never have done on her own. They were both very much in love with each other. There was never any doubt that they loved each other and very committed to the relationship and lived as they felt a husband and wife should.
Did you ever see them disagree?
No. My mum would get cranky. My dad never lost his temper. I think my mum would get a bit moody, but also in those days women were not assertive. Often the way they got their needs met was being a bit moody or cranky or going and having a lie down just to get out of the situation. They had discussions. They talked a lot. They'd go for walks at night, holding hands and talk, and probably to get away from the kids, have a bit of time on their own. I think it was probably a very loving relationship.
Oh, well, thanks for talking to me, Mum. I feel like I know Grandma a bit better.
You almost need to speak to my sisters as well to get another perspective because they were older than me.
Yeah, I suppose so, yeah. Thank you. Well, thanks for taking this walk with me. I know it's been a bit of an unusual episode. I still couldn't tell you for sure why exactly I took that tape recorder out to Wynnum and recorded that interview with my grandma back when I was a teenager, but I'm very glad I did. And really, I'd recommend anyone do that. If there's someone in your life, maybe it doesn't even need to be a grandparent, but sometimes there are older people in your life who have these experiences you might not know about necessarily, and they've lived through things and seen things and lived an entirely different life to you. So, even if you're not a amateur podcaster, maybe you want to go out to see your grandparents, have a chat with them sometime, maybe record it on your phone. Maybe it could be something you give to your kids someday, who knows. My grandma Mabel was born in 1911, before the Titanic sank and before the First World War. And it was interesting listening back to this and going through some old photos with my mum that were taken in the 20s and 30s, looking up old maps of Hurstville and historical photos of the train station and all that. It's been quite a ride. As always, you can get in contact at gimmeempathypodcast@gmail.com. Stop by the Facebook page, Instagram account, Gimme Empathy Podcast. Drop me a line. Always keen to hear feedback. And I've got quite the bank of past episodes to catch up on if you haven't heard them all. A whole 25 others before this. Just sitting there, waiting to fill your ears with knowledge. So until next time, stay ropeable. I don't even know what ropeable means. I'm going to look that up right now. Bye-bye.